Okay, yeah, we're drifting toward disunion, that state of disunion. This basically covers the material that's found in chapter 19 of the American Pageant, for those of you that use the American Pageant. So I'm going to continue this on. Those of you in my class probably should get a pen, pencil, some paper, take some notes. I'm going to try to go through this really quickly as possible, so I don't go too long. Okay, so it's kind of fast, so let's get started. Okay, so first of all, we have two major works that you probably really need to know. 1852, you have Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's a popular book which awakens the passes of the North toward the evils of slavery. Basically, the book's about the splitting up of a slave family and the cruel mistreatment of a likable, Uncle Tom by a cruel slave master. The book actually sells millions of copies. The British people were charmed by it. Of course, the South cried foul, saying her portrayal was wrong and it was unfair. The book actually helped Britain kind of stay out of the Civil War in an abstract way, because people who read the book and had now denounced slavery actually sympathized with Uncle Tom and wouldn't allow the intervention of behalf of the South, especially those that supported the House of Commons, as we talked about in class. Okay, The Impending Crisis of the South, another book that you will probably see on the AP exam, written by Hinton R. Helper. Now, he's a non-aristocratic white North Carolinian. He tried to prove by an array of statistics that the non-slave-holding Southern whites were really the ones most hurt by slavery. Now, both books are published in the North. Both are banned in the South, and they're widely read in the North. And they basically, both of these books are considered two major books that actually drive a major wedge between the North and the South, or at least drive it in the wedge deeper, if you kind of say so. Okay, Northerners began to pour into Kansas, and Southerners were outraged since they had supported the Compromise of 1550 on the impression that Kansas actually would become a slave state. In the election of 1855, you have hordes of Southerners, or border ruffians, from Missouri, which actually flooded the polls and elected Kansas to be a slave state. Well, free soilers were unable to stomach this, so they set up their own government in Topeka, Kansas. So you have this confused people in Kansas that had to choose between two governments, one a legal or free government in Topeka, and the other a fraudulent one, which was slavery government in Shawnee, Kansas. Okay, in 1856, you have a group of pro-slavery raiders shot up and burnt part of the town of Lawrence, which actually escalates this violence in Kansas. Now, John Brown, we're going to talk about John Brown a little bit later too, but for right now, he's considered a crazy man. Some literally say he's crazy, some say he just acts crazy. That's all an interpretational thing. He actually leads a band of followers to Powhatan Creek in May of 1856, and he ends up hacking to death 5 presumably pro-slaverites. Now, the brutal violence, okay, surprised even the most adamant abolitionists and brought swift retaliation from pro-slaverites, and so thus Bleeding Kansas actually earns its nickname because of all the bloodshed that was taking place. In 1857, Kansas had enough people to actually apply for statehood, thus for slavery to, lost my place, okay, had enough people to apply for statehood, and those for slavery devised the Lecompton Constitution, and provided that the people who were only allowed to vote for the Constitution with slavery or without slavery, the only two choices. Even if the Constitution was passed without slavery, those slave holders already in the state supposedly would still be protected. So slaves would be in Kansas despite the vote, which kind of is an oxymoron if you think about it. Okay, angry free soilers boycotted the polls, and Kansas approved the Constitution with slavery. So important to remember that. Okay, in Washington, you have James Buchanan. He had succeeded Franklin Pierce, but like the former president, Buchanan was more towards the South and firmly supported the Lecompton Constitution. Now, Senator Stephen Douglas, refusing to have this fraudulent vote by saying this wasn't true popular sovereignty, his brainchild, remember, threw away his Southern support and called for a fair revote. Now, the Democratic Party was hopelessly divided. It ended the last remaining national party for years to come because the Whigs were dead and the Republicans were actually a sectional party. Uh, Bleeding Kansas was an issue that spilled into Congress. You have Senator Charles Sumner, who was a vocal anti-slaverite, and his blistering speeches condemned all slavery supporters. Now, Congressman Preston S. Brooks decided that since Sumner was not a gentleman, he couldn't challenge him to a gentleman's duel. So Brooks decides that he just would beat the snot out of Sumner with a cane until the cane actually broke. So he beats him until the cane breaks. The nearby senators that were witnessing this did nothing. They just sat there and watched. And Brooks was actually cheered on by the South. The incident actually touched off a major fireworks as Sumner's "The Crime Against Kansas" speech was reprinted by thousands. And it put Brooks and the South in the wrong. Okay, in 1856, the Democrats choose James Buchanan, someone that's basically untainted by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and a person with lots of potential experience to be their nomination for presidency against Republican John C. Fremont, a fighter of the Mexican-American War. Another party, the American Party, which also is called the Know Nothing Party because of its secrecy, was organized by nativists, old stock Protestants against immigrants, who nominated Millard Fillmore. Now, these people were anti-Catholic, they were anti-foreigner, and also included some of the old Whigs. Now, this campaign was full of mudslinging, mudslinging to the tilt, which included allegations of scandal, conspiracy, and every little nasty thing you can imagine. And Fremont was hurt pretty bad by rumors that he was actually a secret or closet Roman Catholic, and so that you're anti-Catholic, but you're supposed to be Catholic. Okay, so Buchanan actually won because there were doubts mainly about Fremont's honesty, his capacity, and his sound judgment. And perhaps it was actually better that Buchanan won, since Fremont was not as strong as Lincoln. In 1856, many people were still apathetic about slavery, and the South could have seceded even more easily to a large degree. But Lincoln's going to come up. Lincoln's starting to move forward in his political career as well. Of course, in March 6th of in March 6th of 1857, you had the Dred Scott decision, which is handed down by the Supreme Court. Dred Scott, kind of give you a background of it. He was a slave whose master had taken him north into free states where he lived for many years. After Dred Scott's master died, he sued for his freedom from his new master, claiming that he had been in a free territory and was therefore considered to be free, or should be considered free. The Missouri Supreme Court actually agrees with Dred Scott, and they free him. But his new master appeals it all the way up to the Supreme Court, which eventually does overrule the decision. Now, the outcome of the case is that Chief Justice Roger Taney, who was the Chief Justice at the time, said that no slave could be a citizen of the U.S., especially in his justification anyway. The court said that the legislative Congress could not outlaw slavery, because it would go against the Fifth Amendment, saying a person's property cannot be taken without due process of law. And that is the big bombshell statement that actually is made during this time. So in this case, the court also concludes that the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional all along, because basically it banned slavery north of the 3630 line, and doing so was against the second part of the argument was that they couldn't do that because of the Fifth Amendment. So those are the three big points of that outcome. Okay, now the case without doubt inflames millions of abolitionists against slavery. And even those who really didn't side one way or the other or didn't care much about it do end up leaning toward the abolitionists. Of course, the Northerners complained about the decision, and the Southerners were ecstatic about the decision. But they are actually inflamed by the Northern Defiance. And of course, more tension builds between the North and the South. Now, as you see on the screen, I got the North and the South scoreboard, okay? And basically what this means when it says 3-1, I bet I'm going to kind of explain that a little bit. First of all, the South has the Supreme Court on the side, as a majority that favor the South that's on the Supreme Court. They have the president on their side, and they have, without a doubt, the Constitution on its side. And the North basically has only Congress on its side, in the majority of Congress on its side. But you got to remember, now they're kind of banned from outlawing slavery, so their power is somewhat limited anyway. Now, there's reasons that I say the Constitution has actually favored the South. Okay, first of all, you have the Supreme Court said so in the Dred Scott case, Dred Scott decision. And remember, the Supreme Court is the one who interprets the Constitution. You have the Fifth Amendment, which Congress could not take away property, and slaves were considered property. Now, there's two key arguments here. One, you could argue that slavery is in the Constitution, and you could use the Three-Fifths Compromise as part of that argument. You could also argue that slavery is not in the Constitution, since the word slavery is not present anywhere in the Constitution. Yet, think about this. If you argue that slavery is not in the Constitution, then you have to deal with the 10th Amendment, which says anything not in the Constitution is left up to the states. And guess what? The southern states would vote for slavery or against slavery. They would definitely vote for slavery. So you have those two arguments. One, you could argue that slavery is in the Constitution by the Three-Fifths Compromise. And you could argue that it's not because the word slavery is nowhere in the Constitution. Yet, if you argue that since it's not, the word slavery is not in the Constitution, you have to look at the 10th Amendment. So remember those two key arguments because they are crucial. Okay, financial crash of 1857, psychologically, the Panic of 1857 is the worst of the 19th century. And I say psychologically because technically it wasn't as bad as the Panic of 1837. The Panic of 1857 is basically caused by three main things. One is the California gold causing inflation. You have overgrowth of grain, oversupply. And then you have over-speculation, which always plays in with these panics through this time. And this time it's actually land and railroad speculation that's taking place. The North, especially gets hit really hard by this panic. The South comes through it with flying colors. They seemingly kind of prove that cotton was indeed king. And, of course, since they ride through with flying colors, it boosts the Southern egos or self-importance, if you want to put it that way. In 1860, Congress passes the Homestead Act that provided about 160 acres of land at a cheap price for those less fortunate. It eventually does get vetoed by Buchanan. It was really not a real popular act because it's opposed by the Northeast, which had long been unfriendly to the extension of land and in fear that it would drain its population even more. And the South, which knew that it would actually provide an easy way for more free soilers to fill into the territories, which they didn't want to happen. So you have this double conflict with this act, from both sides that don't really like it. The panic also brings about calls for a higher tariff rate, which the South isn't going to like, the tariffs have been lowered about 20% over the past few months prior to the panic actually going into place. Okay, I'm trying to speed this up. Okay, you have the Illinois the Illinois rail splitter. Okay, in 1858, I almost lost my track of thought. Senator Stephen Douglas' term was about to expire, and of course, against him, that I told you, is that rising politician, that Republican Abraham Lincoln, shows up on the scene. Abe is considered one of those ugly fellows. Again, that's interpretational, but a lot of people consider him to be ugly, who had actually risen up the political ladder slowly, and he does very slowly, but he is a darn good lawyer, and he had a down-home common sense about him, and he actually is a pretty good debater as well, which we're going to talk about. So that leads us to the great debate, the Lincoln versus Douglas debates. Lincoln actually challenges Douglas. Douglas is actually considered the nation's most devastating debater, one of the most best debaters in the country at the time. And Lincoln challenged him to a series of 7 debates, of course, which Douglas accepts. And everyone pretty well kind of expects Lincoln to fail, or not to be able to hold his own up against this great debater, Stephen Douglas. But Lincoln kind of surprised everybody because he actually does hold his own. And uh, the most famous debate actually takes place in Freeport, Illinois, where Lincoln essentially asked Mr. Douglas if the people, and I'm not sure he had that kind of an accent. Mr. Douglas, if the people of a territory voted slavery down, despite the Supreme Court saying that they could not do so, which side would you support, the people or the Supreme Court? And Mr. Douglas answers one simple answer: Mr. Popular Sovereignty. Now, when he replies this, he actually establishes what becomes known as Douglas's Freeport Doctrine, which basically said that no matter how the Supreme Court ruled, slavery would stay down if the people voted it down, since power was held by the people. Now, Douglas actually won the Illinois race for the Senate, but more people actually voted for aid, so he actually won the moral victory. So Douglas basically won the battle, but he ends up losing the war because his answer in the Freeport Doctrine caused the South to dislike him even more. Now, originally, the South had loved Douglas prior to this, basically due to his popular sovereignty position. But then came the Kansas pro-slavery vote, which he'd shot down. Then the Freeport Doctrine came down, where he turned his back on the Supreme Court's pro-Southern decision. And the Freeport Doctrine, or Freeport Statement that Douglas makes, actually ruined the 1860 election for presidency for Douglas, which he actually really wanted. He wanted all along. That's what he was campaigning for. He was, putting himself up in that position to run for president. Okay, back to our guy John Brown real quick. John Brown plans to invade the South, seize its arms, call upon slaves to rise up in revolt, and take over the South and free it and free all the slaves. But it doesn't work. Actually, the slaves don't show up, and unfortunately, in this raid of Harper's Ferry, Virginia, like I said, the slaves don't revolt, and he's captured by the U.S. Marines under the command of no one less than Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. And again, you'll know that name a lot when the Civil War. And convicted, Brown is actually convicted of treason. He's sentenced to death, and he is hanged. Now, Brown, as I said, some people consider him to be insane, but he was not stupid. And he set out in the trial, and before his death, he portrayed himself as a martyr against slavery. And when he is hanged, he instantly becomes a martyr for all abolitionists. The Northerners rally around his memory. The abolitionists were infuriated by his execution. They kind of had conveniently forgotten about his violent past in Kansas with the slaughtering of the people. They kind of forgot that part, about him. The South is happy. They feel that they saw justice and basically feel that Brown's actions were typical of most radical Northerners. So the South feels somewhat justified in everything. Now, after failing to nominate a candidate in Charleston, South Carolina, Democrats end up splitting into Northern and a Southern faction. At Baltimore, you have the Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, for president, while the Southern Democrats choose John C. Breckinridge. The Know-Nothings, they choose John Bell of Tennessee. Now, these were all originally Democrats, even John Bell was, of Tennessee, and he calls himself the Constitution, they called themselves the Constitutional Union Party, which basically was known, or also known as the Know-Nothings. They tried to mend, fences between everyone, and they offer only as their platform the Constitution. They don't add anything. They don't have any foreign policies or anything else. They just strictly whatever's in the Constitution. That was their platform. Okay, so Republicans, sensing a victory against the split opponents, they actually nominate Abraham Lincoln, not William Higher Law Seward, who many people thought would probably be the better candidate to some degree. Their platform had an appeal to every important non-Southern group. For the Free Soilers, it proposed the non-expansion of slavery. For the northern manufacturers, a protective tariff. For the immigrants, no abridgments of rights. For the West, internal improvements at federal expense. And for the farmers, free homesteads. So the Southerners threatened that if Lincoln's election will result in, well, let me back it up. The Southerners threatened that if Lincoln was elected, they would secede. Now, Lincoln wasn't an outright abolitionist, as I mentioned in class. Since as late as February of 1865, right at the end of the Civil War, Lincoln still favored somewhat of a cash compensation for free slaves. Abraham Lincoln wins the election despite not even being on the ballot in the South. I mean, they didn't even put him on the ballot. They purposely left his name off the ballot, but he still wins. So Lincoln won with only 40% of the popular vote, and had the Democratic Party been more organized and energetic, they actually might have won. It was an extremely sectional race. Okay, the North went to Lincoln, the South went to Breckinridge, the middle ground to the middle of the road, kind of so to speak. Candidate went for Bell, and of course, popular sovereignty lands went to Douglas. The Republicans, and this is a key point, the Republicans, even though Lincoln wins, a Republican, they did not control the House, they did not control the Senate, and the South still had a 5-4 majority in the Supreme Court. So in other words, President Lincoln was the Republican president by the election, and wins, but he doesn't control the House. The Republicans do not control the House, they do not control the Senate, and they don't really control the Supreme Court. So that other two branches are still controlled by those that have Southern sympathies or Southern interests. But despite that, they do hold to their threat that if Lincoln is elected, they will secede, and they do. Okay, South Carolina, as I said, threatened to secede if Lincoln was elected, and they go true to their word. Okay, they secede officially in December. I think it's December 20th at 1:15 p.m. Of 1860. You have Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, all those deep South states. They follow in the next 6 weeks, even before Abraham Lincoln is even inaugurated. Okay, the 7 states met in Montgomery, Alabama on February of 1861, and they officially create the Confederate States of America, and they select Jefferson Davis as the president. Now, keep in mind that Lincoln is not president as of yet. And President Buchanan did nothing to force the Confederacy back into the Union. Now, partly because the Union troops were needed in the West, so he couldn't really have the troops that he could have possibly sent. And the North was still somewhat apathetic towards secession. They weren't, it was kind of an iffy thing. Some people didn't, see a problem with it. And some people said, let them go, and who cares? And we don't really want a war. And so that apathy towards secession existed. So Buchanan, kind of got his hands tied. But basically what Buchanan does, he simply leaves it for Lincoln, hey, when a guy gets sworn in, he can handle this whole thing on his own. Okay, one last shot. In the last minute attempt at compromise, once again on the slavery issue, James Henry Creedon of Kentucky proposed what became known as the Creedon Compromise, which would basically ban slavery north of the 3630 line, extended all the way to the Pacific, and would leave the issue in territories south of the line up to the people. In other words, popular sovereignty. And also, any existing slavery south of the line would be protected. Excuse me. So Lincoln basically does oppose this compromise, though, which might have actually worked. In part because his party had preached against the extension of slavery. But Lincoln, he sticks to his principles and, this concept that he's not going to bend on this issue. It also seems that, like I said, Buchanan just really couldn't save the Union at this point. No matter what he would have done, he couldn't have. It was too far gone. The seceding states did so because they feared that their rights as a slave-holding minority were being threatened. and were alarmed at the growing power of the Republicans. Plus, they believed that they would be unopposed despite what the Northerners claimed. They firmly believe that the North is not going to want to do anything. They're just going to let them secede and break away. They do believe this. The South also hoped that, as soon as it broke away, that it would develop its own banking system, it would develop its own shipping, and they would prosper. And then the bottom line is, if nothing else, they had this one thing to hang on to, is that the remembrance of 1776. You had 13 little colonies seceded from Great Britain and won. And the South believes they can do the exact same thing if pushed to do so. And that's it for Chapter 19, Heading Toward Disunion.